At her first time, he whispered, "You say when to stop." The unthinkable happened that night, and no one was prepared for what would come next. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because the ending will leave you speechless. The scent of champagne mixed with his woody cologne still lingered in the air when Margot felt the world stop. There, in the penthouse of the most luxurious building in Manhattan's Upper East Side, with golden lights reflecting off imported marble and the panoramic view showing 1,000 lit windows in the warm summer night, she heard the words that would change everything. You say when to stop. But what happened next, the unthinkable, wasn't what anyone would imagine. Because that 21-year-old woman, with her floral dresses bought at Brooklyn thrift stores and her habit of reading Emily Dickinson poetry in a quiet voice, was about to discover that innocence has a far higher price than she ever dreamed of paying. The city stretched before them like a tapestry of fulfilled promises and broken dreams. Lights flickered to the rhythm of lives unfolding, oblivious to that moment suspended in time. Margot wore an ivory dress she'd bought at a small boutique in Greenwich Village, so different from the designer pieces hanging in his closet. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the crystal flute, watching bubbles ascend in perfect spirals, as if each one told a story of something about to begin. Reed watched her with those deep hazel eyes that seemed to contain oceans of lived experiences. At 43, every line at the corners of his eyes told a story. The silver threading through his dark brown hair gleamed under the soft light of designer lamps. There was something in his posture, the way he leaned against the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands in the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit, that transmitted absolute confidence. He was a man who had conquered the business world over 2 decades, who had built an empire on foundations of relentless ambition. But in that moment, as he watched her, there was something more in his gaze. Something she couldn't quite decipher. Vulnerability, need, or simply the reflection of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly connected to another human being. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Margot whispered, lowering her gaze to the flute. Her voice sounded small in that expansive space, almost lost among the soft sound of jazz coming from speakers hidden in the walls. He approached, each step measured and deliberate across the dark hardwood floor. When he stood before her, he lifted her chin with 2 fingers, forcing her to meet his eyes. The height difference was evident. She had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. "Margot," he said her name like a prayer, each syllable pronounced with reverent care. "There's no rush, no expectations. There's only this, 2 people who chose to be here, in this moment." But what happened next, the unthinkable, wasn't what anyone would imagine. Because this 21-year-old woman, with her thrift store dresses and her habit of reading poetry in hushed tones, was about to discover that innocence carries a price far steeper than she ever dreamed of paying. There are moments in life that divide existence into 2, before and after. Moments when we cross invisible thresholds and become versions of ourselves we never imagined being. This was one of those moments, though Margot didn't yet know it completely. 6 months before that decisive night, Margot worked among dusty shelves at the New York Public Library on 5th Avenue, where the scent of aged paper and fresh coffee from the Italian espresso machine was her only daily luxury. Her hands always had ink stains from return stamps, and she wore the same beige cotton shawl that had belonged to her Massachusetts grandmother. A dreamer by nature, kind to the point of naivety, she possessed a vulnerability that showed in every delicate gesture. The library building was a labyrinth of knowledge accumulated over centuries. The high ceilings with their deteriorating frescoes told stories of past eras. The long corridors smelled of beeswax and antiquity. Margot knew every corner, every shelf, every book, as if they were old friends. She moved among them with the familiarity of someone who had found their place in the world. Her greatest internal conflict was the constant battle between the desire to be truly loved and the paralyzing fear of not being enough for anyone. A fear that made her accept crumbs of affection as if they were complete feasts. She'd felt it with the few boyfriends she'd had, boys her age who treated her as something temporary, a pleasant distraction, until something better came along. She lived in a small apartment in the Lower East Side that she shared with 2 co-workers. The walls were thin, and you could hear everything happening in neighboring apartments. But it was her space, decorated with old movie posters and makeshift shelves full of books she'd collected since adolescence. It was on a rainy Tuesday in March when Reed first appeared. Rain beat against the library's tall windows, creating a hypnotic rhythm. Margot was organizing a new shipment of books on architecture when she saw him approaching. Tall, imposing, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her annual rent. His hair showed those silver strands that only years bring, evident marks of his well-lived 43 years. "Excuse me." His voice was deep, measured, with a slight refined Boston accent that added a certain musicality to his words. "I'm looking for recommendations on American colonial architecture." Margot looked up from the books she was cataloguing. For a moment, their eyes met. There was something in that gaze that made her lose the thread of her thoughts. It was as if he could see directly through all her defenses, all her insecurities, straight to the core of who she really was. "Of course," she managed to say, suddenly aware of her ink-stained hands, her simple clothes. How ordinary she must seem compared to the women a man like this was probably used to. "We have an extensive section. Looking for something specific? Any particular period or region?" He smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through the grey clouds of the rainy day. "Surprise me. I trust your judgment." For the next hour, Margot guided him through the shelves, carefully selecting volumes on Boston, Charleston, Williamsburg. She spoke passionately about each book, sharing details she'd absorbed during years of working within these walls. He listened with genuine attention, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated deep knowledge of the subject. "It's evident you love what you do," he commented, as she showed him a particularly beautiful volume on New England meeting houses, with color illustrations capturing every detail of the structures. "Books are windows to worlds I'll never visit," she responded with sincerity. "Each page is a journey." "You've never been to Williamsburg?" She shook her head, feeling a pang of shame at her lack of experiences. "I was born in Boston, but we moved to New York when I was a child. I've never had the opportunity to travel much." Something changed in his expression. A softness appeared in his eyes. "That's refreshing. In my world, everyone has been everywhere. No one has the capacity to marvel at anything." He returned the following Thursday, and the Tuesday after that. Always at the same time, always with increasingly specific questions that forced her to research for hours to impress him, without even realizing why it mattered so much. What Margot didn't know was that Reed had been watching her from much earlier. 3 weeks after their first conversation, Reed invited her for coffee after her shift. They went to a small cafe near the library, a modest place with worn marble tables and waiters who'd worked there for decades. The contrast with the man sitting across from her, so elegant, so refined, was almost comical. "I need to confess something," he said, stirring his espresso without actually drinking it. The afternoon light entered through the window, illuminating his profile. Margot noticed small scars near his ear, marks of a fully lived life. "I didn't come to the library by chance." Margot's heart accelerated. "What do you mean?" "I saw you 3 months ago," he continued, finally looking directly at her. "It was at the Union Square Farmers Market. It was pouring rain. You helped an elderly woman carry her groceries, got completely soaked while holding the umbrella only over her. I was in the coffee shop across the street having my usual espresso when I saw you." Margot remembered that day. The woman was struggling with too many bags and an umbrella, slipping on the wet pavement. It had been instinctive to help her, to accompany her to her building, even though it meant arriving late to work and soaked to the bone. "Did you follow me?" she asked, not knowing whether to feel flattered or alarmed. "Not exactly," he smiled slightly. "But I asked about you. Found out where you worked. I needed to know the person who would do something like that without expecting anything in return. In my world, nobody does anything without first calculating what they gain from it." "That sounds lonely," Margot said with honesty. Reed fell silent for a moment, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the window. When he spoke again, his voice had a tone of melancholy she hadn't heard before. "I built an empire over 20 years. I have properties in the best areas of New York, a company worth millions, connections with the most powerful people in the country. But every night I return to that penthouse in the Upper East Side completely alone. I eat off expensive plates that have no taste. I sleep on silk sheets that feel cold, and I wonder when it was that I traded the ability to feel something real for all this." There was a vulnerability in his words that touched something deep in Margot. She, who had always felt inferior, inadequate, suddenly saw this powerful man for what he really was, human, wounded, searching for something money couldn't buy. "What are you looking for, Reed?" she asked softly. He looked at her directly, and in those hazel eyes there was an intensity that made her hold her breath. Authenticity. Real connection. Someone who looks at me and sees the person, not the bank account. And I think you might be that person. The most dangerous connections are those born from the desire to save someone, because when you become someone else's lifeline, you forget that you also need to breathe. The first formal date came a week later. Reed picked her up in a sleek black car that seemed to glide over the New York asphalt. Margot had spent hours choosing what to wear, finally deciding on her only simple black dress. She felt inadequate beside him, but Reed had been clear. "Come exactly as you are, that's what I want to see." He took her to a private rooftop restaurant in Soho. It wasn't a place where she imagined she'd end up someday. Tables were covered with white linen tablecloths. Each piece of silverware was a work of art, and crystal glasses reflected candlelight like small constellations. The women around them wore jewelry that probably cost more than everything she'd earned in her life. Their dresses were by designers whose names Margot had only seen in magazines. She felt like an intruder in a world that didn't belong to her. Reed noticed her discomfort. He extended his hand across the table and took hers. "You're the only real person in this entire place," he whispered, and his words were like balm on her insecurities. The dinner was a parade of dishes that were true works of art. The sommelier treated each bottle of imported wine as if it were a sacred relic, explaining the history of each vineyard, each vintage. Margot tasted each bite with curiosity, marveled by the flavors exploding in her mouth. "Tell me about yourself," Reed requested between courses. "Your family, your dreams, what you really want from life." And she talked. She told him about her childhood in Boston, about her father who worked in a traditional bakery since before dawn, about her mother who made the best Boston cream pies in the neighborhood. She told him about her love for books, about her dream of someday writing her own stories. She told him about her fears, about that constant feeling of not being enough that had pursued her since adolescence. He listened with attention she'd never experienced before. He didn't interrupt, didn't redirect the conversation to himself. He simply listened, nodding occasionally, asking questions that showed he was truly absorbing every word. "You're 21, he said finally, when dessert arrived, a chocolate creation that seemed to defy gravity. "Your whole life ahead of you. Doesn't it scare you to be here with me? I'm 43. I could be your father." The honesty of the question caught her by surprise. "I'm more scared of the idea of living a safe and predictable life, of ending up like so many people I know, working in the same place for 40 years, marrying someone because it's what's expected, having kids because it's the next step, and waking up one day at 60 wondering if they ever really lived." Reed smiled, and there was genuine admiration in that smile. "You're wiser than your age suggests. Or maybe I'm just naive enough not to be afraid yet," she responded, and they both laughed. But there was truth in her words. Margot still didn't know real fear, the kind of fear that comes from being so deeply involved in something that losing it would be devastating. She hadn't yet learned that sometimes the security she despised was actually wisdom in disguise. The following 3 months were like living in a dream Margot feared waking from. Reed enveloped her in a world she only knew through pages of novels. Weekend trips to vineyards in Napa Valley, where she tasted ripe grapes directly from the vines and felt the warm afternoon sun on her skin. He taught her to distinguish between different varietals, to appreciate the nuances of each wine. "The Pinot Noir is like you," he said one afternoon as they walked between rows of vines. "It has a deceptive sweetness, but there's depth underneath that only reveals itself with time." The weekends they didn't travel, they cooked together in his penthouse. Reed prepared New England clam chowder while telling stories of his travels through the South over decades. The sound of the knife against the cutting board mixed with old Sinatra playing on the sound system. Margot learned to measure the cream, to listen for the perfect simmer. "My grandmother taught me this," he confessed one night, stirring the pot with concentration. "She said a man who can't feed his family isn't really a man. At the time, that sounded old-fashioned. Now I understand what she meant. There's something sacred about preparing food for someone you love." The words "someone you love" floated between them like unspoken promises. There were also nights at Lincoln Center, where she cried openly during the saddest arias. The music transported her, the voices tearing something in her chest she didn't know she could feel. Reed handed her linen handkerchiefs, drying her tears with a tenderness that spoke of experience, of someone who had lived long enough to understand the depth of human emotion. But there were signs. Small cracks in the perfect facade. The way Reed controlled every detail became evident. What clothes she should wear to certain events, who she should or shouldn't talk to at social gatherings, how much time she could spend with her family. At first, she interpreted it as care, as concern for her well-being, but gradually it began to seem like something more. The first real argument happened when Margot wanted to visit her mother in Boston. "You don't need them when you have everything here," he said, and there was something new in his voice. Fear. Fear of losing her, of being abandoned, of discovering she was like all the other people who had passed through his life. Temporary. "They're my family," Margot responded, feeling a spark of rebellion she didn't know she possessed. "I can't just disappear from their lives." "They don't understand what we have," Reed insisted, pacing through the living room, his hands gesturing uncharacteristically. "They'll see the age difference, the money, and draw conclusions. They'll fill your head with doubts." "Maybe they're right to doubt," the words came out before she could stop them. He stopped abruptly, looking at her as if she'd slapped him. For a moment, the silence between them was so dense that Margot could hear her own heart beating. Then something changed in his expression. The hardness melted, replaced by a vulnerability she'd only glimpsed. "You're right," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "They have every right to doubt. I would doubt too if I saw my daughter with a man like me. But Margot," he approached her, taking her hands in his. "I need you. I can't explain how or why, but I feel complete for the first time in decades, and the idea of losing you terrifies me." In that moment, Margot saw for the first time the vulnerability hidden beneath layers of power and control, and instead of using that revelation as a warning sign to protect herself, she felt a dangerous compassion. She thought she could save him, this 21-year-old who had barely begun to live. We confuse love with the need to be needed. We think that if someone can't live without us, it means our love is deep. But real love doesn't cling, doesn't control, doesn't suffocate. Real love gives space to breathe, even when it hurts to do so. Her best friend, Celia, saw what Margot refused to see. They met at a traditional cafe in the village, a timeless place where New York conversations had flourished for generations. The old mirrors infinitely reflected the marble tables, creating the illusion of endless space. Celia, a practical teacher who'd known Margot since childhood in Massachusetts playgrounds, was direct. "That man is devouring you whole. Look at yourself," she said, pointing to Margot's reflection in the nearest mirror. "Where's the girl who read by the Charles River, who wore wildflowers in her hair? You're transforming into the version he wants, not who you are." "I'm growing," Margot protested, though she knew there was truth in her friend's words. "He's in his 40s, Margot, more than twice your age. He's already lived, already made his mistakes. Don't let him steal your chance to make yours." Celia took her hand urgently. "Love shouldn't feel like losing pieces of yourself to fit into someone else's life." The words hurt because they held truth, but Margot ignored them. Love, she thought, required sacrifices. She didn't yet perceive that sacrifice and self-annihilation are very different things. She didn't understand that freely giving parts of yourself is very different from having them taken bit by bit without noticing. That night, lying in the enormous bed of the penthouse with Reed sleeping beside her, Margot stared at the ceiling and wondered who she really was. The elegant moldings, the shadows that city light cast through expensive curtains, everything suddenly felt alien to her. When was the last time she'd read a book just for pleasure? When had she last wandered aimlessly through New York, getting lost on unknown streets just for the joy of discovery? But love, when it's new and all-consuming, has the ability to make you forget who you were before. It convinces you that the person you're becoming is better, more refined, more complete. Only later, when illusions fade, do you realize you lost something essential along the way. The second revelation came on a rainy Sunday in October, 7 months after they'd met. Margot was organizing the closet, a task Reed had suggested needed doing, though she saw no problem with how things were, when she found the photograph. It was hidden at the bottom of a drawer of suits, Inside a yellowed envelope. A girl of about 9 with chestnut braids and eyes that were unmistakably Reed's looked at the camera with a shy smile. Her heart stopped. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in blue ink, Avery, Martha's Vineyard, March 2023. Throughout all those months, all those conversations about the past and future, Reed had never mentioned he had a daughter. When he arrived that evening, Margot was sitting on the living room sofa, the photograph on the coffee table like damning evidence. He saw it immediately upon entering, and his face paled. "Were you ever going to tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of pain and betrayal. Reed set his briefcase on the floor with deliberate care. He removed his rain-dampened blazer, hanging it meticulously on the coat rack by the door. Each movement seemed designed to buy time, to order thoughts. Finally, he sat on the sofa across from her, separated by the coffee table and the photograph staring at them both. "Her name is Avery," he began, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "She's 9 years old. Lives with my mother on Martha's Vineyard. Why didn't you ever mention her?" Margot felt tears burning in her eyes. "We've shared everything, talked about everything, but this... Why?" "Because she's my greatest failure." The words came out like a painful confession. "And I didn't know how to tell you without having you see me differently." Over the next hour, while rain beat against the windows and the city darkened beyond the glass, Reed told a story he'd kept as a shameful secret for years. He'd married at 32 to a woman named Catherine, a business colleague. The marriage was a product of convenience more than love, two ambitious people who thought they could build an empire together. Avery was born a year later. "I was a terrible husband," he admitted, looking at his hands as if he could see all his past failures in them. "I was obsessed with building my company, with proving to the world I was someone. I worked 18-hour days, traveled constantly. When I was home, I was mentally absent, checking emails, planning the next acquisition. Catherine had endured it for 3 years. Then, one morning when Avery was 3, she simply disappeared. She left a cold letter on the kitchen table. It said she hadn't signed up to be a single mother while married, that she loved her career more than she could ever love a family, that Avery would be better off without a mother who didn't want her. I found her crying in her room," Reed's voice broke. "My little girl with her doll clutched to her chest asking where Mommy was, and I had no answer. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that her mother chose to leave? That she wasn't important enough to stay?" He'd tried raising Avery alone for a year. He hired nannies, reduced his work hours, did everything humanly possible, but a traumatized child needed more than he could give while trying to keep an empire afloat. His mother offered to help, and gradually, what was meant to be temporary help became a permanent arrangement. "I see her every 2 weeks," he continued. "Video calls every night. I spend every Christmas and summer with her. I pay for the best school, the best therapy, everything. But I know it's not enough. Nothing compensates for the fact that her mother abandoned her, and her father basically left her with his mother." "That's why you never mentioned her," Margot finally understood. "You were afraid I'd judge you." "I was afraid you'd see the truth," he corrected, "that I'm a 43-year-old man who failed at the most basic thing, being a good father. What 21-year-old would want to be with someone like that?" Margot moved around the table and sat beside him. She took his hands, noticing how they trembled slightly. "I want to meet her," she said firmly. "If we're going to have a future together, I need to know your daughter." He looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. "Doesn't this make you reconsider everything?" "It makes me understand you better," she responded honestly. "It makes me see that you're human, that you make mistakes like everyone, and it makes me want to help you be better. There's a thin line between wanting to help someone be better and taking responsibility for fixing their past mistakes." In that moment, Margot didn't know which side of that line she was falling on. 2 weeks later, Margot met Avery on Martha's Vineyard. Autumn had tinted the oak leaves gold and copper. They fell in slow spirals, covering the stone paths with a crunchy carpet. Avery arrived holding her grandmother's hand, an elderly woman with kind eyes who assessed Margot with the protective gaze of someone who'd seen too much. The girl was shy, hiding her face partially behind her grandmother. Her eyes, so similar to Reed's, watched Margot with cautious distrust. She wore a navy blue dress and shoes that were clearly new, probably bought especially for this occasion. "Hi, Avery." Margot knelt to be at her level, offering a gentle smile. Your dad has told me so much about you. He said you like stories. The girl nodded slightly without speaking. I love them too, Margot continued. I work surrounded by books all day. Actually, I brought something for you. She pulled an illustrated book from her bag. I thought maybe we could read it together. Would you like that? Avery looked at her grandmother, who nodded with approval. Slowly the girl approached and took the book, running her small fingers over the illustrated cover. That first afternoon was careful, tentative. They walked along the beach, fed seagulls, shared ice cream at a small stand, despite the cool air. Margot didn't try to force connection, simply was present, sharing stories about the books she loved, listening when Avery occasionally shared something about her school or her friends. Reed watched from a distance, giving them space. His face showed a mixture of hope and anxiety that broke the heart. Margot could imagine all the times he'd brought other women to meet his daughter, only to have them reject the idea of getting involved with a traumatized child. But Margot wasn't like those women. She saw in Avery something she recognized, a girl desperately seeking to be loved without conditions, without abandonment. It was a reflection of her own deepest fears. Sometimes we connect most deeply with people who reflect our wounds, not our strengths. We recognize the other's pain because we know our own intimately. But that connection can be both healing and destructive, depending on how much of ourselves we lose in the process. The following weeks brought more visits. Margot traveled to Martha's Vineyard almost every weekend. Gradually, Avery began to open up. She talked about school, about how sometimes other girls asked why her mother never came to pick her up. She talked about dreams where her mother returned, and how she'd wake up crying when she remembered it wasn't real. Why did she leave? She asked one afternoon while they made friendship bracelets sitting on the floor of her grandmother's cottage. Did I do something wrong? Margot felt her heart break. No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes adults make terrible mistakes. They make decisions that have nothing to do with the people they leave behind. It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. Are you going to leave too? Avery's eyes filled with tears. No, Margot promised, hugging the girl to her chest. I'm not going anywhere. It was a big promise, maybe too big for someone 21 years old to make. But in that moment, with that child trembling in her arms, Margot believed every word. She didn't yet understand that promises made from the heart are sometimes impossible to keep when reality becomes more complicated than you ever imagined. While Margot built a bond with Avery, her relationship with her own family began to fracture. The first time she brought Reed to meet her parents at their bakery in South Boston was a disaster. Lillian, her mother, with hands perpetually covered in flour and eyes that never missed a detail, assessed him from the moment he crossed the door. Thomas, her father, normally quiet and contemplative, barely concealed his disapproval. The bakery was small, the sales space in front and the wood-fired oven in back. The place eternally smelled of fermenting dough and fresh-baked bread. It was a scent Margot associated with home, with security, with unconditional love. Seeing that space through Reed's eyes, so different from his world of penthouses and luxuries, made her feel ashamed, and then ashamed of that shame. He's 43 years old, Margot. 43, Lillian repeated, while kneading dough for dinner rolls with excessive force after Reed had left. Her hands trembled with anger, with fear. He could be your father. When you were born, he was already a grown man. Don't you see? I love him, Margot responded, though even as she said the words, part of her wondered if it was true or if she was trying to convince herself. Love isn't enough, Thomas intervened, his eyes sad. Men like that don't marry girls like you. They play around and then go back to their world. You're a whim, a fantasy of youth for him. When he gets tired, he'll leave you heartbroken. You don't know him, Margot protested, feeling tears burning. You don't know what he's really like. We know how men are, Lillian said firmly, and we know that a 22-year age difference isn't love. It's a power imbalance. He has all the experience, all the money, all the control. What do you have? She had no answer. Or rather the answer, my youth, my admiration, my willingness to mold myself to his needs, was too painful to say aloud. She left the bakery that night with the weight of her parents' disappointment like stones on her chest. She called Reed from the bus stop, crying, needing him to tell her everything would be okay. It doesn't matter what they think, he assured her. The only thing that matters is what's between us. They live in a small world, Margot. They can't understand what we have. When someone tells you your family can't understand that they live in a small world, it's a warning sign. They're isolating you, creating a narrative where only you two understand the truth, where everyone else is wrong. It's the first step in cutting you off from the people who truly know you, who would love you even when they discover all your flaws. But her parents' words had planted seeds of doubt that grew like weeds in neglected gardens. Margot began noticing more things. The way Reed expected her to be available whenever he needed her, but often cancelled plans with her when something came up with work. The way he subtly criticized her choices, her clothes, her friends, even her favorite books, always under the guise of helping her grow. The way every conversation about the future included what he needed, but rarely what she wanted. When Catherine, the ex-wife and current business partner, appeared at more events, tensions escalated. It was at a gala at the Met. Margot wore a dress Reed had chosen, shoes that hurt her feet, makeup applied by a professional that made her look like someone she didn't recognize in the mirror. Catherine arrived alone, wrapped in a dress that probably cost what Margot made in a year, with the kind of confidence that only comes from decades of professional success. "You're sweet," Catherine said, when Reed stepped away to talk with potential investors. Her voice was soft, almost maternal, but there was steel underneath. She held a glass of wine that reflected the museum lights like liquid blood. "But you're so young, so inexperienced." "Reed seems satisfied," Margot responded, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "For now," Catherine smiled, and it didn't reach her eyes. "But he needs someone his age, someone who understands his world. Sweet gets cloying, dear. It's pleasant for a while, but eventually you want something with more substance. And let's be honest, how much longer will you challenge him intellectually? You're a librarian who's never left the East Coast. He's conquered international markets." The words were like poison, seeping into doubts Margot already had. That night, when Reed and she returned to the penthouse, she couldn't stop thinking about them. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, while he prepared for bed. "Being with me instead of someone more appropriate for your life?" Reed stopped, looking at her through the bathroom mirror. "What makes you ask that?" Catherine said, "Catherine has no right to say anything about our relationship." His tone was firm, almost angry. "She's jealous. Jealous that I found something real with you, something she could never give me because everything for her is transaction, business, strategy." "But maybe she's right," Margot persisted. "Maybe I'm too young, too inexperienced. Maybe eventually you'll get tired of explaining things to me, of showing me the world." He approached, taking her face in his hands. "I didn't bring you into my life to mold you into someone you're not. I want you exactly as you are, curious, kind, with that capacity to marvel that all of us lost decades ago. But pretty words don't change patterns of behavior. You can say you love someone for who they are while simultaneously trying to change every aspect of that person. The contradiction is painful to recognize, both for the one doing it and the one suffering it." The marriage proposal came 3 weeks before everything started falling apart. It was a December night when the first cold winds from the north brought the scent of coming snow over the city. There was no dramatic kneeling or applauding crowds. Just Reed and Margot in the penthouse kitchen, preparing New England clam chowder together, one of the few activities where they felt genuinely equal, without hierarchies of age or experience. "Marry me," he said, pulling a dark blue velvet box from his apron pocket. The ring was a solitaire diamond that sparkled like a captured star, probably worth more than everything Margot owned combined. Her heart stopped. They talked about the future in vague terms, but this was real, definitive. "But you need to understand that my world has rules," he continued, his expression serious. "I need to protect what I've built over 20 years, protect my daughter, protect our future together. There will be a contract. It's standard in these situations." The words should have sounded like alarm bells, but Margot only heard, "Marry me." In that moment, with the aroma of cream and clams floating in the air, with this man who represented a whole new world offering permanent commitment, she said yes before fully processing the rest. Life's most important decisions are often made in ordinary moments. Not during grand romantic gestures, but while you're making soup in a kitchen, while walking through a park, while washing dishes together. These everyday moments reveal the true nature of a relationship, And they're also the moments where emotion can cloud your judgment. The prenuptial agreement arrived a week later. It was delivered by lawyers in impeccable suits who drank espresso from porcelain cups, speaking in incomprehensible legal terms. 60 pages detailing every aspect of their future married life. What would happen if she left, how much she'd be entitled to, how much she wouldn't. Clauses about behavior, public appearances, relationship with the stepdaughter. It's standard, the lawyers assured, looking at her with a mixture of pity and condescension. After all, she was 21 and he was 43. It was obvious who needed protection in this transaction. But when Margot read the document alone that night, late with chamomile tea in her trembling hands, she understood what it really said. She could lose everything at any moment. But Reed would never lose anything. Every clause was designed to protect him, to ensure that even if the marriage ended, his life would continue exactly as before. While the most painful clause was about Avery. If the marriage ended, Margot would have no legal right to see the girl she'd bonded with over months. Avery wasn't legally her daughter, she was just Reed's daughter. And if he decided to cut that relationship, she would have no recourse. "Why do you need this?" she asked when he returned that night. She'd been crying and didn't try to hide it. "Why do you need to protect yourself so much from me?" "It's not personal," he responded, loosening his tie. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than ever. "It's how my world works. I've seen too many men financially destroyed by marriages that ended badly. I can't risk what I've built. I can't risk Avery's future." "But you're asking me to risk everything," her voice broke. "If this ends, I lose not only you, but also Avery. I lose everything I've built in the last months. And you simply continue as if nothing happened." "Life isn't fair," he said, and there was something cold in his tone that Margot hadn't heard before. "You're 21, your whole life ahead to start over if this doesn't work. I'm 43, with responsibilities I can't simply ignore." Those words revealed a fundamental truth Margot had been avoiding. For Reed, she was replaceable. Young, malleable, willing to adapt to his world. But his company, his status, his lifestyle, those things were irreplaceable. And the contract made clear which was more valuable to him. She should have left that night. Celia had begged her to when Margot told her about the contract. "It's a trap, don't you see? He's buying you just like he buys properties. And when he gets tired or finds something better, he'll discard you." But Margot signed anyway. She signed because she was 21 and believed love could overcome legal papers. She signed because she'd promised Avery she wasn't going anywhere. She signed because the alternative, returning to her previous life, admitting her parents were right, facing the disappointment in their eyes, seemed impossible to bear. There's a certain kind of cowardice in staying in a bad relationship. Not the cowardice of being afraid, but the cowardice of not having the courage to disappoint people, to admit you made a mistake, to start over. Sometimes it's easier to keep going down a wrong path than to admit you chose the wrong direction from the beginning. The wedding date was set for the following spring, 16 months after their first meeting in the library. It would be at a historic inn in the Berkshires, a place combining elegance with rusticity. Margot imagined an intimate ceremony, just close family and dear friends. But Reed had other ideas. The guest list grew to 200 people, mostly business partners and professional contacts. The menu cost more than her parents' bakery's annual budget. The dress he chose, because of course he chose, was beautiful but didn't feel like her, with its elaborate neckline and train that required 3 people to maneuver. "It's our day," she protested weakly when she saw the plans. "It's our debut as a couple in my circle," he corrected. "These people are important for my career, for our future. They need to see we're united, that you're appropriate for my life." Appropriate. The word stuck with her like a splinter under the skin. When had she stopped being simply herself to become something that needed to be appropriate? Wedding preparations brought more tensions. Catherine appeared constantly, offering help that felt more like interference. She suggested changes to everything, flowers, music, even the color of Avery's flower girl dress. And Reed, inexplicably, considered her opinions with seriousness he didn't give to Margot's. "She has experience with these events," he explained when Margot protested. "She's organized dozens of galas, she knows what works." "But it's our wedding." Margot heard herself getting smaller, more defeated with each conversation. "And I want it to be perfect. He kissed her forehead distractedly, already looking at his phone for the next important email. Trust me, okay? When someone constantly asks you to trust them while systematically ignoring your opinions, they're not asking for trust. They're asking for submission. And there's a crucial difference between the two that we often only understand when it's too late. 3 weeks before the wedding, Reed's world began to crumble. Margot arrived at the penthouse one afternoon and found him sitting in the dark, a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the table. He didn't look up when she turned on the lights. His face, normally so composed and controlled, was haggard. The expression lines seemed to have deepened in hours, and his eyes were red in a way that suggested he'd been crying. Reed. Her voice was tentative, frightened. What happened? I lost everything, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Or I'm about to lose it all, same difference. She sat beside him, taking his hand. It was cold, trembling slightly. Over the next hour, while the city darkened beyond the windows and New York's lights flickered like earthly stars, he told her everything. Bad investments in coastal real estate. He'd bet heavily on luxury developments just before the market crashed. Partners who'd betrayed him after 2 decades of collaboration, moving money to offshore accounts, leaving him with all the legal responsibility. Imminent lawsuits that could ruin him completely. I could lose everything, the penthouse, the properties in the Hamptons and Aspen, everything, he continued, pouring himself another generous drink. The lawyers say there's a possibility I'll end up with massive debts. Everything I built over 20 years disappearing. Margot felt the world spin, not because of the money, it had never been about money for her, but because of what this meant. The elaborate wedding they couldn't afford anymore, the future they'd planned, the stability Avery needed. What are we going to do? She asked. He finally looked at her, and there was absolute defeat in his eyes. I would understand if you wanted to leave now. Actually, you probably should. I'm not the man you met anymore. And you're so young, you have your whole life ahead. You don't need to carry the ruins of a 43-year-old man. It was the first time he'd mentioned the age difference as a reason for her to leave, instead of a reason for her to stay. And there was a certain brutal clarity in that honesty. Without the money, without the status, what was left? Who was Reed without all that? In crisis, we discover who we really are and what we truly value. The masks we wear in times of abundance fall away, revealing the naked faces beneath. And sometimes what we see frightens us so much, we'd rather flee than face it. Margot could have left. Part of her, the sensible part, the part that sounded suspiciously like her parents' voices, told her this was the exit she needed, that the universe was giving her a chance to escape before making a mistake that would define the rest of her life. But she looked at the broken man before her and saw something beyond the successful businessman, beyond the elegant lover who'd shown her a world she never knew. She saw a terrified human being, facing the loss of everything that had defined his identity for decades. She saw someone who'd been abandoned before and was preparing to be abandoned again. I didn't fall in love with your bank account, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. It was the first time in months she'd felt completely certain of something. I fell in love with you, and yes, I'm young, but I'm not stupid. I know what I'm choosing. For the first time that evening, she saw tears run down his face. Why? Why would you stay? Because love isn't about how easy it is to be together when everything goes well, she responded, words she didn't know she possessed. It's about choosing to stay when everything falls apart. And yes, I'm scared. Terrified, actually. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you. Sometimes we confuse sacrifice with love. We think that the more we suffer, the more we give up, the more real our love is. But true love doesn't require you to lose yourself to find the other. It doesn't require you to drown to save someone else. The following 2 months were the hardest of Margot's life. They cancelled the elaborate wedding at the Berkshire's Inn. They simply didn't have the money for it. Reed began selling properties, fighting in courts, negotiating with creditors in tense meetings lasting hours. His face became more haggard each day. The silver in his hair spread, as if stress were physically aging him before her eyes. Margot went back to working full-time at the library. They needed her salary, however modest. She also took extra shifts, working until her hands ached from stamping books and her eyes burned from reading under fluorescent lights. At night, she cooked simple meals with basic ingredients from the farmer's market, remembering recipes for pot roast and apple pie her mother had taught her. Elaborate dinners were replaced by these humble meals. Outings to theatres and operas disappeared. Conversations about future travels transformed into pragmatic discussions about how to pay next month's rent. Because yes, they'd had to leave the Upper East Side penthouse. They moved to a small apartment in Brooklyn with thin walls and noisy neighbors. The bathroom had cracked vintage tiles. The kitchen was so small only one person could be in it at a time. There were no panoramic views, just the interior courtyard of a century-old building where everyone's laundry hung on crisscrossing lines like flags of surrender. And strangely, in this forced simplicity, something changed. Without the veil of wealth, they were just two people trying to survive together. They shared bagels with coffee on cold mornings, planning each expense carefully. Reed learned to cook simpler dishes and laughed at his own mistakes when he burned the rice. Margot learned to negotiate with landlords and creditors, discovering strength she didn't know she had. For the first time, the age difference seemed less important. They were both equally lost, equally scared. His 43 years of experience meant nothing when everything he knew had crumbled. Her 21 years of youth didn't mean weakness when she was the one finding creative ways to stretch every dollar. "I don't know how to thank you," he said one night while they washed dishes together in that tiny kitchen. "For staying, for not running when you had every right to." "I'm no saint," she responded honestly. "There are days I wonder if I made a mistake. Days I miss the security of before." "Before me," he understood. "Before all this," she corrected. "But then I remember that security can also be a prison, and I'd rather have this uncertainty with you than the certainty of a life I never really chose." But there was a truth neither wanted to face. She wasn't staying only for love. She was staying because leaving would mean admitting her parents were right, that she'd made a massive mistake, that she'd wasted a year of her life. Pride can be as powerful as love, in keeping us in places that don't serve us. Avery's permanent arrival complicated everything in ways Margot hadn't anticipated. Avery's grandmother needed to move to an assisted living facility on Martha's Vineyard. She could no longer care for a 9-year-old girl. And so suddenly Margot found herself being a mother without any preparation, without any real choice in the matter. Avery arrived with 2 suitcases and a worn stuffed animal that had clearly been a comfort during difficult years. Her eyes, so similar to her father's, looked at the small apartment with evident confusion. This wasn't what she'd seen on her occasional visits to the luxury penthouse. This was ordinary, poor even. "Are we going to live here?" she asked, her voice small. "For now," Reed responded, and there was shame in his tone. "Things have changed, sweetheart. But we're still a family. Where's my room?" That was the first problem. The apartment only had 2 small bedrooms. Reed and she shared one. They'd assumed Avery would use the other, but Avery had constant nightmares, residue from abandonment trauma. The first night she woke up screaming. The second night she appeared at their bedroom door, crying, saying she was scared. It became routine, Avery sleeping in the middle of the bed between them. The intimacy Margot and Reed had had disappeared instantly. There was no space for private conversations, for couple moments, for anything that didn't include the child. Margot loved Avery, genuinely, but she wasn't prepared for this level of responsibility at 22. Nobody had asked if she wanted to be a mother now. It had simply happened, and she was expected to adapt. Mornings were chaotic, getting Avery ready for school while trying to get herself ready for work, making the girls' lunch, checking her homework, making sure she had everything she needed, then rushing to get to the library on time, often arriving late and receiving disapproving looks from her supervisor. Days became an exhausting routine of work, picking Avery up from school, helping her with homework on American history that Margot barely remembered from her own school days, making dinner, bathing her, reading to her until she fell asleep. Only then, with Avery finally asleep, did she have moments with Reed. But they were too tired to really connect. He came back exhausted from meetings with lawyers and creditors. She was drained from juggling work and instant motherhood. They sat on the couch in silence, watching TV shows without really seeing them, until one of them said, "We should sleep," and they dragged themselves to bed. "It's not what I imagined," Margot confessed one night to Celia during one of their infrequent phone conversations. She spoke in a low voice from the bathroom, so neither Reed nor Avery could hear. I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Like I put on someone else's clothes and they don't fit right. Because it's not your life, Celia responded with her characteristic honesty. It's his life, his daughter, his problems, his crisis. Where are you in all this? I'm here. I'm helping. No, you're disappearing, losing your youth, your opportunities, your own identity. Margot, look at yourself. A year ago, you were a girl who read poetry and dreamed of writing her own stories. When was the last time you wrote anything? When was the last time you did something just for you? Margot had no answer. The months had become a blur of obligations and responsibilities. She'd stopped reading for pleasure. She'd stopped wandering aimlessly through New York, discovering new streets. She'd stopped dreaming about her own future, because all her present was consumed with keeping this family together that she hadn't even consciously chosen. Forced motherhood is one of the most silent forms of losing your identity, especially when it happens so young, before you've had a chance to discover who you are without others' needs defining you. It's not that you don't love the child. It's that you resent the circumstances that made it impossible to choose. The fights with Avery also began. The girl was processing her own trauma, her own loss. The move from her grandmother's house to this small apartment, the new school in New York where she knew no one, the father who was now constantly stressed and absent even when present. It was all too much, and she took it out on Margot. "You're not my mother," she screamed during an argument about homework. "You have no right to tell me what to do." The words were like slaps. Margot froze in the middle of the kitchen, feeling tears burning in her eyes. Because Avery was right. She wasn't her mother. She was just a 22-year-old woman who'd chosen to stay for love of a man, and now was trapped in a role she'd never signed up for. Reed heard the scream from the other room. He came running, seeing his defiant daughter and Margot with tears running down her face. Avery apologized immediately. His voice was stern in a way Margot had rarely heard. "Why should I? It's true, she's not my mother. My mother left because she didn't want me, and she'll probably leave too." That was the moment Margot fully understood what she'd taken on. She wasn't just raising a girl. She was trying to heal abandonment trauma while simultaneously dealing with her own trauma of not feeling enough. She was trying to be a mother figure without real authority, without legal bond, knowing that at any moment Reed could decide it wasn't working, and she'd lose all contact with this child she'd invested so much in. That night, after Avery finally fell asleep, after tears, forced apologies, and Reed's promise to find a therapist for her, Margot sat on the apartment's tiny balcony and cried. She cried for the girl she'd been a year ago, so full of dreams and possibilities. She cried for the woman she was becoming, exhausted and resentful. She cried because she loved Reed but wasn't sure that was enough to sustain everything expected of her. She cried because she loved Avery, but sometimes wished she'd never met her, and then felt guilty for that wish. Resentment grows in silence in the spaces between what we say and what we feel. It feeds on unrecognized sacrifices, on ignored needs, on the constant feeling that you're giving more than you receive. And eventually, resentment kills love slowly and painfully, until what remains is only the ghost of what you once felt. The breaking point came unexpectedly, as moments that change everything tend to. Margot was organizing papers, trying to maintain some order in the chaos of legal documents that now defined their lives, when she found Reed's will. She wasn't looking for it. It was simply there, in a poorly closed folder, and her name caught her attention. Or more specifically, the absence of her name. The will had been recently updated, after she and Reed got engaged. It named Avery as sole heir to everything remaining of his estate. It established a trust fund for her education, her future. It named Catherine as Avery's guardian should anything happen to Reed. Catherine, his ex-wife, the woman who'd abandoned her daughter at 3. She would be the guardian, not Margot, who'd been raising the girl for months. Margot didn't exist in that document. Not as a future wife, not as a potential guardian, not as anything. It was as if her entire presence in their lives was temporary, disposable, not important enough to deserve legal protection or recognition. When Reed arrived that evening, she was waiting for him with the document on the table. "What is this?" Her voice trembled with contained emotion. He looked at the paper and paled. "Margot, when were you going to tell me?" she interrupted. "Or were you never going to tell me? Was I just going to find out if something happened to you? I can explain. Then explain. Her voice rose, and somewhere in the apartment she heard Avery moving in her room, probably waking from the noise. Explain why after a year together, after I gave up everything for you, after I'm raising your daughter, I'm not important enough to appear in your will. Reed ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd seen 1,000 times. It's complicated. With the legal problems I have, I didn't want to tie you to any additional liability. This isn't about legal liability. Tears flowed freely now. It's about you seeing me as temporary, as someone who's here now but probably won't be later. And Catherine, seriously, the woman who abandoned Avery is a better choice than me to take care of her. She has experience. I have love, Margot shouted. I'm the one putting her to bed every night. So I'm the one wiping away tears when she has nightmares. I'm the one who's here every day trying to be what she needs, even though I'm terrified of failing. And you see me as so disposable I don't even deserve legal protection. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with all the unspoken things that had accumulated for months. You're 22, he said finally, and there was weariness in his voice. I'm 44. The truth is, you probably won't be here in 5 years, in 10 years. You'll probably wake up one day and realize you wasted your youth on an old man and his problems, and I don't want, when that day comes, for you to be legally trapped. So this is for me? Her laugh was bitter. You're protecting me by treating me as temporary. I'm protecting you by being realistic, he responded. My first marriage failed. Avery was already abandoned once. If you also leave eventually, I need to know there's a backup plan. And there was the naked, brutal truth. He'd never truly trusted that she'd stay. All this time, even while accepting her help, even while allowing her to raise his daughter, a part of him was preparing for inevitable abandonment. Self-fulfilling prophecy. You treat someone as if they'll leave, and eventually they will. You know what's saddest? Margot wiped tears with the back of her hand. You were right from the beginning. The age difference matters. Not because I'm too young to understand love or commitment, but because you're too cynical to believe in them. Your 44 years taught you to protect yourself, to plan every contingency, to never be vulnerable, and that means you can never truly trust anyone. Margot, I'm leaving. The words came out before she could think them through completely. Not now, not tonight. Avery doesn't need more trauma. But I'm leaving, because I can't live being someone's temporary plan. I can't keep giving everything of myself to people who don't believe I'll stay. Reed didn't try to stop her when she walked to the balcony, needing air. He didn't say the words she secretly hoped for, that he was wrong, that he'd changed the will, that she was important. He just stood there, in the middle of their small apartment with his crumbled life, and let the silence confirm everything she feared. Avery appeared in her bedroom doorway, with her worn stuffed animal clutched to her chest. She'd heard everything, obviously. Her eyes were red from crying. "Are you leaving like Mom?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. And that was the final blow, because Margot had promised. She'd promised she wasn't going anywhere. But that promise had been made by a naive girl who thought love was enough, that sacrifice would be recognized, that eventually she'd be seen as a permanent part of this family. "I don't know, sweetheart," she responded honestly, kneeling to be at the girl's level. "I don't know." Margot spent the following days in a kind of trance. She went to work, fulfilled her obligations, returned to the apartment. She interacted with Avery, prepared meals, did everything expected of her. But it was as if she were watching herself from outside, seeing this young woman execute movements of a life that didn't belong to her. Reed tried to talk several times, but each conversation ended in the same place. Him defending his realism, her pointing out that realism was just another word for lack of trust. It was as if they spoke different languages. It was Lillian, her mother, who finally pulled her from paralysis. She appeared one afternoon at the library without warning, still wearing her bakery apron stained with flour. The smell of fresh-baked bread came with her, that aroma of home and security that Margot hadn't realized how much she missed. "Your father and I thought we should let you make your own mistakes," she began without preamble, sitting in one of the reading chairs. "But seeing you like this, I can't. Not when I see my daughter disappearing bit by bit." "Mum, listen to me," she interrupted firmly. "When we said that man was too old for you, it wasn't just about the years. It was because someone his age has already decided who he is, already has established patterns, ways of seeing the world that won't change no matter how much you love or sacrifice. You, at 22, are still discovering who you are. And he's molding you into what he needs instead of allowing you to flourish into what you could be. The words were like spears, each one finding target because Margot already knew their truth. He said, "I'll probably leave him eventually," she confessed, "that I'm too young to stay." And you know what? Lillian took her daughter's hands. Maybe he's right. Not because you're fickle or immature, but because people grow, change, discover new parts of themselves. And sometimes that growth means leaving behind things that no longer serve, even when it hurts to do so. But Avery has a father, her mother said firmly. She has therapists. She has family. It's not your responsibility to save her. And I think part of why you held on so tight is because you saw in her your own fears of abandonment. But healing her wounds won't heal yours. Sometimes the people closest to us see truths we refuse to see, not because they have special wisdom, but because they're not blinded by the emotions that cloud our judgment. And when we finally listen to those truths, they hurt precisely because we recognize them. That night, Margot did something she hadn't done in months. She went walking alone through New York. She left Reed and Avery in the apartment without explanations, without arguments. She simply left. She walked aimlessly through familiar streets that suddenly seemed new. The Village with its narrow alleys, Times Square with its overwhelming lights, Central Park where couples kissed under lampposts and elderly people fed pigeons. She sat by the reservoir, watching how moonlight reflected on the water in silver fragments. Around her, life continued. People laughing, talking, living their own complicated stories. When had she stopped being the protagonist of her own story to become a secondary character in Reed's? When had her dreams, writing, traveling, discovering the world at her own pace, been replaced by his crises? She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. It had been over a year since she'd written anything of her own. Her fingers trembled as she began typing. There's a kind of love that consumes you until nothing of you remains. They tell you that's passion, commitment, devotion, but really it's self-destruction. And the hardest part is admitting you chose to be consumed, that you confused losing yourself with finding your place. The words flowed. Months of repressed emotions poured into disorganized paragraphs. She wrote about the girl she'd been, about the illusions she'd had, about the painful awakening of understanding that sometimes loving someone isn't enough if that love requires you to bury essential parts of yourself. When she finally returned to the apartment hours later, Reed was awake, waiting. Avery was sleeping in her room. They'd been working with her on sleeping alone, small but significant progress. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come back," he said when she entered. "I considered not coming back," she responded honestly. "I walked all over New York thinking about what I'd do if I just kept walking, where I could go, what it would be like to start over. And I realized I can't make a decision about the rest of my life while I'm exhausted, resentful and lost," she said, sitting on the couch but keeping distance between them. "I need space. Time to remember who I am without being your partner, Avery's mother figure, the version of me everyone needs." "What are you saying?" "I'm going to stay with Celia for a while." She'd made the decision while walking back. "Not forever. Just to breathe, to think, to write, which is something I loved and completely abandoned for this life. And Avery." "Tell her the truth," Margot responded, "that I need to take care of myself before I can take care of anyone else, that I'm not abandoning her, but I also can't keep sacrificing myself until nothing's left of me." He looked like he wanted to protest, but something in her expression stopped him. Maybe he was finally seeing what everyone else had seen from the beginning, a young woman who'd lost herself trying to find love. "And us? I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know I can't keep being this version of me. I need to find out who Margot is when she's not trying to save you, not trying to be Avery's mother, not trying to fit into a world that was never meant for her." The act of choosing yourself after months of choosing everyone else doesn't feel like empowerment. It feels like selfishness, like failure, like betrayal. But sometimes, saving yourself requires disappointing the people you love, and that's the hardest part of all. The 3 weeks Margot spent at Celia's apartment were transformative in ways she didn't anticipate. Celia lived in a studio in Williamsburg, not far from Margot's parents' bakery. It was chaotic, filled with books stacked on every surface, movie posters on walls, plants that survived miraculously despite irregular attention. It was so different from Reed's minimalist penthouse or even the tidy apartment they'd shared. And in that chaos, Margot found freedom. She spent mornings writing before work. Not elaborate stories, just thoughts, feelings, observations about the life she'd lived in the past year. Words flowing without censorship, without worrying about how they'd sound or who would read them. In the afternoons after work, she walked. She rediscovered her New York, the city she'd loved, before seeing it only through expensive restaurants and social events. She found small used bookstores in the East Village. She sat in cheap diners with coffee and a book, without agenda, without rush. In the evenings, she talked with Celia about life, about love, about what it means to truly build an identity. "It's not about whether you love Reed," Celia said one night, while they shared cheap wine and cheese from the corner store. "Clearly you do. The question is, can you love him without losing yourself? Can he love you without molding you into what he needs?" "I don't know," Margot admitted. "Part of me thinks maybe I'm the problem. That I'm too selfish, too immature to handle an adult relationship with real responsibilities. Responsibilities you never chose," Celia pointed out. "Margot, you're 22. Most people our age are going out, making mistakes, discovering who they are. You're raising a traumatized child while your partner goes through a massive financial crisis. That's not selfishness, it's survival." Reed called every day. At first, Margot didn't answer. She needed the silence, the space to hear her own thoughts without his persuasive voice in her ear. But after the first week, she started responding. The conversations were different, more honest, more raw. Without physical proximity, without the established dynamic of their shared life, they could say truths they'd been avoiding. "Avery asks about you every day," he said during one of these calls. "Her therapist says she's regressing, that she sees your absence as another abandonment." The comment was designed to provoke guilt, and it worked. Margot felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, but this time, something in her resisted. "Then tell her why I left," she responded. "Tell her that people need to take care of themselves to be able to take care of others, that taking space isn't abandonment, that I'm going to come back, but I need to make sure that when I do, I'm a complete version of me, not just the fragments you left." "That was unnecessarily cruel." His voice was cold. "Is the truth cruel? Or are you just used to me softening every hard edge so as not to make you uncomfortable?" The silence that followed was long. Finally he spoke, and there was something different in his tone. Something that might have been respect. "You're right," he admitted. "I got used to your flexibility, to your willingness to adapt, and I confused that with compatibility. But really I was creating a version of you that served my needs, not allowing you to be who you really are." They were the most honest words he'd said in months. "So what now?" Margot asked. "What do we do with this realization?" "Honestly, I don't know," he responded. "But I know I don't want to lose you. And I know that means I have to change. Not words, not promises. Real change. True change is the hardest of all because it requires admitting you were wrong, not just in actions but in fundamental patterns of behavior. It requires dismantling who you've been for decades and rebuilding something new. And most people, especially at 44, prefer the familiarity of their flaws to the discomfort of transformation." Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening. Reed was facing complete solo parenting for the first time. Without Margot there to manage morning routines, to help with homework, to calm nighttime terrors, he had to do everything. He left important meetings early to pick Avery up from school. He cooked clumsy dinners the girl ate with politely skeptical expression. He sat with her while she did homework, discovering how much he didn't know about fourth-grade curriculum. It was exhausting, but it was also necessary. One night, after a particularly difficult day where Avery had had a meltdown at school, Reed called Margot and simply said, "I didn't understand. Everything you did, everything you managed. I thought I was contributing equally, but I wasn't, not even close. And?" Margot wasn't going to make this easy. "And I'm sorry. Not just words, but genuinely. I took everything for granted. Your youth, your energy, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for us. And I never gave you the recognition or legal protection you deserved because I was afraid. Afraid that if I really let you in completely, The pain would be unbearable when you left. Self-fulfilling prophecy, Margot murmured. Exactly, he admitted. My therapist, yes, I started therapy, says I have abandonment patterns that date back long before Catherine. My own father left us when I was a kid. I've spent my whole life building walls, making sure nobody can hurt me like that again, and in the process I've hurt everyone who tried to love me. It was the most vulnerable admission Margot had heard from him, and she felt something soften in her chest. That part of her that had always wanted to believe change was possible. What happened with your legal cases? She asked, changing the subject because the emotion was too intense. Catherine is helping, he responded. Not romantically, he added quickly, but we sat down and had an honest conversation about Avery, about the past. Turns out she also has her own regrets about how she handled things. Doesn't justify the abandonment, but we're complex humans, all of us. So is she still going to be the guardian? No, he said firmly. If you and I can work this out, I want it to be you. I'm changing the will, the prenup, everything. I want you legally protected, officially recognized. Not because I think it'll make you stay, but because it's right. Because you matter regardless of what happens with us. Actions speak louder than words, but first there have to be words. There has to be acknowledgement of faults, promises of change, and then there has to be follow-through. Days, weeks, months of demonstrating that the words weren't just manipulation to get you back. Margot returned to the apartment in the third week, not because he begged, not because she felt guilt about Avery, but because she'd remembered who she was and decided she wanted to fight for this relationship, but on her own terms. Avery ran to hug her the moment she crossed the door, embracing her with force that stole Margot's breath. You promised you wouldn't leave, she sobbed against her shoulder. You promised. And I came back, Margot responded, stroking the girl's hair. Sometimes we need time apart to be better when we're together. That's not breaking promises. It's taking care of ourselves so we can take care of the people we love. That night, after Avery finally fell asleep in her own bed, major progress, Reed and Margot sat at the small kitchen table with new documents between them. A revised will, a revised prenup, adoption papers for Avery, everything designed to protect her legally, to recognize her as an integral part of this family. You don't have to sign anything now, he said. Take the time you need. Actually, I want an independent lawyer to review them, someone who represents only your interests. It was that gesture, recognizing she needed independent protection, that meant the most. Also, he continued, pulling out another document, I found this larger apartment in Park Slope. 3 bedrooms, space for each of us to have privacy. It's within our budget now that the legal things are resolving. I want you to see it before deciding if it's where you want to live. You're giving me a choice? You're part of this, he said simply. Your opinions matter. Your comfort matters. Your life matters as much as mine and Avery's. It should have been like that from the beginning. True change shows itself in small, consistent gestures, more than in grand declarations, in asking opinions before making decisions, in recognizing emotional burden, in creating space for the other person to be complete instead of only what you need them to be. The following 3 months were of careful reconstruction. They moved to the Park Slope apartment. Margot had her own office where she could write, a space with a window facing the street where morning light entered perfectly. It was small, but it was hers. Avery had her room decorated with posters of her favorite things. And Reed had an office where he could work on rebuilding his company without invading the common space. The age difference still existed, obviously. Reed was 44, she was 22. But now, instead of being something he used to control or she used to doubt, it was simply a fact. He'd lived more, she was still discovering life, and both things could coexist without hierarchy. They started couples therapy. A wise therapist who didn't take sides but helped them see destructive patterns, both brought to the relationship. Margot learned that her need to be needed came from her own insecurity, not from genuine love. Reed learned that his need for control came from abandonment trauma, not from wisdom of age. Avery also progressed in her own therapy. Nightmares became less frequent. Her behavior at school improved. And slowly she began calling Margot Mom, not all the time, but occasionally, in moments of affection or need. Each time it happened, Margot felt a complex mixture of emotions. Joy for the trust it represented, Fear for the responsibility. Love for this girl who'd entered her life so chaotically. But now, with space to breathe, with professional support, with Reed truly co-parenting instead of delegating, it felt manageable. Margot's parents also visited more frequently. Lillian and Thomas still had reservations about the relationship, but seeing the real changes, seeing their daughter flourish instead of wither, they began to soften. "I was wrong about some things," Thomas admitted one Sunday while they shared pot roast in the new apartment. "I thought he'd just use you and discard you, but he's trying. That's more than most men would do." "Trying isn't perfect," Lillian added, still protective. "But maybe none of us are perfect. Maybe that's what real love is about, choosing to work on it even when it's hard." Reed, who'd heard from the kitchen, came to the table and extended his hand to Thomas. "Thank you, and I know I still have a lot to prove, not just to you, but to Margot every day." It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. Margot's work also changed. She decided the library, though comfortable, wasn't where she wanted to be forever. She started taking night classes in creative writing at NYU. She began submitting short stories to literary magazines. Most were rejected, but 2 were accepted for publication. When the first printed copy of a small literary magazine arrived with her story on page 15, she cried. Not for the achievement itself, it was a modest publication, but for what it represented, proof she hadn't completely lost the person she'd been before meeting Reed. She could be a partner, could be a mother figure to Avery, and still be Margot who wrote, who dreamed, who had her own ambitions. But the final test came unexpectedly. A major publisher saw one of her published stories. They offered an opportunity, a year-long writing residency in Boston. Modest salary, studio space, mentorship from established writers. It was an opportunity any emerging writer would kill for. But it meant a year away from New York, away from Reed, away from Avery. When Margot received the offer letter, her first instinct was to say no immediately. How could she leave? Reed still needed her. Avery still needed her. The family they'd built so carefully was still fragile. But then she remembered the therapist's words. If your relationship only works when you're constantly sacrificing, it's not a healthy relationship. It's dependency. That night she showed the letter to Reed with trembling hands. He read it completely, his expression carefully neutral. When he finished, he set the paper on the table and looked directly into her eyes. "You have to go," he said. "What?" "You have to go," he repeated firmly. "This is your opportunity, your career, your dream. And if you stay for me, for Avery, you'll eventually resent us, and I'll have been right. But Boston is 4 hours by train," he continued. "You can come on weekends. We can visit you. It's not perfect, but it's manageable. And more importantly, it's right for you." Margot felt tears burning in her eyes. "What if this breaks us? What if the distance is too much?" "Then we would have broken eventually anyway," he responded with brutal honesty. "Because if our relationship requires you to bury your ambitions, it doesn't deserve to survive. Margot, I love you. I love who you are, including your talent, your dreams, your need to grow. And loving you means supporting that, even when it's inconvenient for me." It was the hardest and most loving thing he'd said. Avery took the news with surprising maturity. "Will you come back?" she asked simply. "Every weekend I can," Margot promised. "And you can visit me in Boston. I'll show you the city, we'll eat cannoli in the North End, visit museums." "Promise?" The girl's eyes sought reassurance. "I promise. And this time it's a promise I know I can keep, because I'm not running away, I'm growing. And you can grow and still love the people who matter. Sometimes the greatest love is letting go. Not permanently, not with finality, but temporarily, with trust that what you have is strong enough to survive distance. And if it's not strong enough, then at least you discover that before losing more of yourself trying to sustain something that wasn't meant to be sustained." The night before Margot left for Boston, the 3 of them sat on the couch of the Park Slope apartment, Avery between them, her head on Margot's shoulder, her feet on Reed's lap. They watched a movie none of them really processed, simply existing together in that moment. "We're going to be okay," Reed whispered eventually. "All of us." "How do you know?" Margot asked. "Because we're finally being honest, about who we are, what we need, what we can give, and honesty is a better foundation than any romantic illusion." Margot smiled through tears. When did you get so wise? When a 22-year-old woman had the courage to show me that my 44 years of experience meant nothing if I wasn't willing to keep growing. 18 months later, Margot was finishing her first novel's last chapter in Boston. The window overlooked the Charles River, where rowers glided across water that reflected autumn colors. The afternoon sun painted everything in golden tones. Her phone rang. Reed, video call. Did you finish? He asked when she answered. Behind him, she could see the apartment in New York, Avery doing homework at the kitchen table. Just wrote the last words, she responded, feeling a mixture of relief and melancholy that comes with completing something significant. I'm proud of you, he said simply. And he was. She could see it in his eyes. No jealousy, no resentment about her absence, just genuine pride. I'm coming back this weekend, she said. We need to talk about things. Something in her tone alerted him. What kind of things? Good things, she assured quickly, but in person. Some conversations need to be face-to-face. The weekend arrived with clear skies and perfect fall Boston temperatures. Margot took the early train, watching New England landscapes pass by the window. She was 24 now. Reed would be 46 in 2 months. The age difference was the same, but somehow mattered less each year. When she arrived at the apartment, Avery ran to hug her as always. The girl had grown, now 11, beginning to show signs of the teenager she'd become, but the hug was as needed as ever. I missed you, she murmured against Margot's shoulder. Me too, sweetheart. That night, after Avery slept, Reed and Margot sat on the apartment balcony with wine glasses. The city vibrated below them, alive and eternal. The publisher wants to publish my book, Margot finally said. That's incredible. He took her hand, squeezing with genuine pride. But they also offered a permanent position in Boston, as part of their editorial team, good salary, benefits, opportunity to keep writing. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Permanent position meant no more coming every weekend. It meant decisions about their future together. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I don't know, she admitted. I've been so happy in Boston. I've grown so much, but I miss you both and I wonder if there's a way to have both. We could move, Reed said, and the statement surprised her completely. To Boston. My company is virtual now anyway. Avery could transfer to school there, and we'd be together. You'd do that, leave New York? Margot, I spent 20 years building an empire in New York and almost lost everything because I prioritized the wrong things. These last 18 months watching you grow, flourish, become the writer you were always meant to be, taught me that home isn't a place. It's who you're with. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I feel like my whole life I've been divided between what I want and what others need. But this feels like both can coexist. Because they can, he said firmly, but only if we keep being honest. If we keep checking in, adjusting, making sure we're both growing instead of one sacrificing for the other. What about Avery? I asked her yesterday morning before you arrived. I said we could move to Boston to be closer to you, that it would be a big change, but I thought it was worth it. You know what she said? Margot shook her head, unable to speak through emotion. She said, Mom, Margot makes us all better. Wherever she is, that's where we should be. That was the moment Margot knew with absolute certainty. She hadn't wasted these years. Yes, it had been hard. Yes, she'd lost parts of herself temporarily, but she'd also gained something precious. A chosen family, built not on romantic illusions but on hard work, brutal honesty, and willingness to keep choosing each other day after day. A month later, they packed their lives in boxes. The Park Slope apartment was rented to a young couple who reminded them of themselves in simpler version. Avery started at a Boston school, initially nervous, but gradually flourishing. Reed established an office in Boston, discovering the city offered different but exciting opportunities. And one summer afternoon, at a small cafe near the public garden where trees provided constant shade, Reed finally asked the question he'd been waiting to ask correctly for years. "Marry me," he said, without an elaborate ring this time, just his extended hand and absolute honesty in his eyes. "Not because I need to complete you, not because I want to mold you into something, but because I choose to keep choosing you, growing with you, building a life that honors who we both are." Margot looked at the man before her. 46 to her 24. A difference that would always exist. But now, after everything they'd been through, after almost losing it all, after learning to love honestly instead of desperately, age felt like just a number. Yes, she said, but with conditions. He smiled. I expected you'd say that. No prenups designed to protect only you, she began, counting on her fingers. Shared decisions about everything affecting our family. Space for me to continue my career without guilt. And commitment to keep going to therapy even when it seems we don't need it. I accept everything, he said without hesitation. Anything else? Yes, she smiled through tears. Promise me we'll keep growing. That if in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, we discover we're growing in different directions, we'll have the courage to be honest about that too. I promise we'll keep being honest, he responded, about everything. Always. They married 6 months later in a simple ceremony on Cape Cod. No 200 business guests, just close family and dear friends. Lillian cried, finally believing her daughter had found something real. Thomas walked Margot down the sandy aisle, whispering, I'm proud of you, not just for finding love, but for never losing who you are in the process. Avery was flower girl, her dress the color of the ocean. When Margot and Reed exchanged vows they'd written together, honest about challenges and hopes, the girl cried happy tears, because finally, after years of instability, she had what she'd always wanted, a family that chose to stay. In the years that followed, there were more challenges. There were moments where the age difference created friction, when Reed wanted to retire early and she was just starting her career, when their friends were different generations, when their perspectives on raising teenage Avery differed. But each time, they returned to their foundational commitment, honesty, space to grow, willingness to work on it. Margot published 6 novels. One became a bestseller, another adapted for TV. She gave lectures on writing, became a mentor. Reed sold his company, dedicated himself to consulting and philanthropy, establishing a foundation for young entrepreneurs. Avery grew to be a thoughtful young woman studying psychology. You showed me trauma doesn't define you, she said at her high school graduation, that you can heal and still carry scars. And on quiet nights, when Margot and Reed sat on their balcony overlooking Boston with wine glasses and the satisfaction of a well-lived life, they reflected on their journey. Do you ever regret it? She asked once. All the trouble I caused in your orderly life? He laughed. My life was many things, but never really orderly. It was controlled, rigid, empty of anything meaningful. You messed it all up in the best possible way. I was 21, she murmured, marveling at how young she'd been. And I was 43, he responded. We both thought we knew what we were doing. We were both completely wrong. But we found our way eventually. It wasn't unthinkable after all, she said, remembering that first night in the penthouse when everything seemed about to begin, with no idea what really awaited them. Or maybe it was, but for different reasons than anyone imagined. What was unthinkable, he asked, curious, that two people so different at such different life stages, with impossible obstacles between them, could find a way to build something real, something that honored both instead of demanding one disappear. Reed kissed her forehead tenderly. The unthinkable is always possible. It just requires brutal honesty, constant work, and choosing to keep choosing each other even when it's easier to give up. And as the sun set over Boston, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margot knew she'd found what she'd been searching for all her life. Not perfection, not ease, but real connection built on a foundation of mutual truth. She'd crossed that invisible threshold years ago in the luxury penthouse, transforming from naive young woman into someone who understood that true love isn't found in perfect first times in marble penthouses, but in thousands of small moments where you choose to stay, grow, and build something real under American skies. The first time she surrendered wasn't a physical act in a luxury penthouse. It was when she finally surrendered her fear of not being enough and chose to believe she was worthy of love that didn't require her disappearance. And that surrender, that act of faith in herself as much as in another person, made all the difference.